Goodbye. Our next presenter is Jase Short. Jase is a PhD student in ancient philosophy at the New School for Social Research. His focus has been on the pre-Socratics and Plato, with adjacent interest in the broad genre of the fantastic, from ancient mythic poetry to contemporary law and film. Although Jase is an academic, he has long engaged in public outreach by way of activism, including environmental, anti-racist, union, anti-war, and so on, and in this regard has focused almost entirely on public education. He is a single dad to a beautiful 7-year-old child, and relaying lessons from the ancient world to them has been a powerful force in shaping how he thinks about the accessibility of research. Education as an egalitarian project for helping us to live better lives as individuals and as a social whole is central to who he is and what he does. Today, he will be presenting The Open Maw of the God King, the tragedy of Kronos and its statues as political critique in antiquity. Not statues, status as political critique in antiquity. I'm sorry, Jase. After I've made, oh, hang on, there we go. After I've made such a mess of introducing you, I'm just going to go away and leave you to it.
Okay, I haven't done this screen sharing thing, though. I hopped on a little early in anticipation of doing that.
You should be able to just press the green button at the bottom and
green
select.
Button?
Yep.
Okay. We can start right. Let's see. Sorry, just one.
No, you're fine. For people watching, this will be our final presentation of the day. If you have questions for Jase, please make sure you put them in the chat. And following his presentation, there will be a social hour. I'm not entirely sure how that works, but I think we will be given instructions in a little bit. Perfect.
Okay,
Yep.
So are we good? Can everybody hear me all right?
Yes, yeah, you're great.
Okay, so the title of my presentation is The Open Maw of the God King, and it is about Kronos as a figure in particularly archaic and classical Greek antiquity, though there will be some mentions of Saturn and Saturnalia and developments afterwards. But I'm going to just jump on in here with the first slide. Okay. So this is a very famous image. I'm sure that a lot of people are familiar with. It's Saturn devouring his son. Let's just pretend it says Kronos for our purposes, because it's, depicting more or less the same thing. So this is part of Goya's Black series, privately produced on the walls of the Quinto del Sordo, where he had retreated basically in frustration and a sense of gloom and doom, cynicism about the prospects for a Republican Spain. There had been, years of war, the Peninsula War. There had been Spanish troops fighting on behalf, French troops fighting on behalf of the Republican efforts, but they, nonetheless, they had carried out a number of atrocities, and he had sort of done a lot of protest by doing artworks that depicted the horrors of these atrocities on both sides. And all of the work that he did at this time, he focused on as, he thought of it as just for himself. This was not for anyone else. And a lot of the work was damaged and so forth when it was removed from the walls in order to be displayed later. Nonetheless, one of the things that his most striking image was this. We see Saturn or Kronos sort of cowering in a dark space where there's, the way the light hits him, it's like like someone's holding a torch or something, and he's being caught, and his eyes are wide. He sees that he's caught, and I think there's something significant to that imagery, and that imagery stuck out. It wasn't just Goya who called upon it, though I think this is the most salient example, but it all kind of came back to this image of Kronos or Saturn devouring his children. And in this version, you can see it's very gruesome, and Kronos is sort of the figure of the counter-revolution. But as we'll see, Kronos is a little bit more complicated as we go back to the archaic period. So who are we talking about here? Saturn, Kronos. First, we should understand that this is in this early period, the archaic period, not to be confused with chronos, like time, okay? They will later be fused, but at this time, there is no time god of this type, at least not in the tradition we're dealing with Chronos. It gets a little complicated because it's actually in the classical period that the fusion begins, but nonetheless. So he in the story that I'm going to focus on, which is from Hesiod's Theogony and the Works and Days, he's a Titan. Titans are kind of god. He's the youngest child of the Titans Uranus and Gaia. And these are, Uranus is sky, Gaia is earth, but you don't want to think of them as the god of the sky or the god of the earth. These are just the sky and the earth, and those things are gods. So the earth on your feet that you put your feet down on, that is Gaia. And these are some of the primordial entities that Hesiod introduces. The first one is chaos, and that the word is more like our sense of chasm or gap, opening. And then there's Eros, who drives things together. And there's Gaia, and Gaia gives existence to Uranus from herself. And she has these children, and one generation are the Titans, which are sort of the former gods. And the next generations are monsters of various kind, which are very exciting for me. So one thing to keep in mind too, these are not, these in the story, in the narrative, these are former gods, but we're not looking at an example here of like an Olympian cult that is displacing an older cult. This is a kind of literary creation. These other gods, there are ritual sites, there are, forms of worship of them, but not all of them, but notably Rhea is one, is a big one. There's some things for Kronos himself, but they are more of a less cult figures, more literary, poetic, mythical, if you will. So Kronos is the father of Zeus, and that is the most important aspect of him, especially for Hesiod. As MOS says, his visible characteristics and attributes derive from his position as father and predecessor to Zeus. And he's described as Denatatos Paidon, that is the most fearful of children. His youth is emphasized again and again. So we've got a very ancient god, but his youth and his willingness to act on behalf of his mother for the injustice that she is suffering, which we're going to get to in a moment, is emphasized. So going on to the next, let's just go just a brief historical context here. I'm sure a lot of you all are familiar with this, but this is the Archaic period, and we roughly talking 800 to 550 BCE. And you have Phoenicians, Etruscans, various people from the Italian peninsula, and Greeks traveling and establishing settlements all over the Mediterranean and the Black Sea area. Now, this period has been described by Walter Burkhardt as a Orientalizing period. Classicists, as we know, still use the term Oriental and Orientalization. That is probably something that ought to go, I think, but nonetheless. And what this term means, the Orientalization period, is a period in which Greek-speaking peoples absorbed a lot of the art and culture of those around them. You can see it in the example I gave there of the Kouros, that's on the bottom left. That's a very stolid figure of a man. It's very Egyptian in style, very rigid. On the bottom right there, we have one of the many sea monster creatures, the Kitos. And of course, there are Greek names for these and so forth, but a lot of them are inspired by this figure of the sea monster, which was very significant in among Semitic peoples, as again, I'm sure many of you know from your own expertise. One thing that's important for me and connected to other research I'm doing on reconstructing the earliest forms of Pythagoreanism is that Egyptian and Near Eastern temple complexes had a major influence on the cultural development of these Greek-speaking populations, introducing the notion that there might be a way to live in which one can understand the world and use that understanding to govern and to bring about a kind of justice for the people that one rules over. Of course, these temple complexes, they were also, these were landowners. They had peasants attached to them and so forth. So you can see where the governance comes in. Hesiod, of course, is a major figure of this, who was influenced, by this culture. The East Face of Helicon by M.L. West really lays this out quite well. So I'm going to move on to Hesiod. So Hesiod, we can tell from a variety of things in his Theogony and Works and Days, and from some of the fragments, especially the Catalog of Women, that there is a lot of familiarity with Near Eastern accounts of the gods, everything from the Song of Kamarbi, the Hero-Hittite tale, to the Enuma Elish. There's a lot. And I would not really have time to go into all of that here. But for instance, Kronos himself, this is not, we don't think this is a Greek name. We think it's probably derived from a Semitic people. Not really sure who. So as we know, there is no central doctrine of Greek religion. It's more of a matter of ritual practice. Thus, many versions of these tales exist. So Hesiod, through the Theogony and Works of Days, he sort of coheres a lot of accounts and becomes the sort of standard. Heraclitus will say that he's the teacher of men. He doesn't say it in a nice way, but what's meant by this is that he sort of established a framework. Homer had established this whole ethos from which one could think about character and ethics and action in the midst of crisis. But Hesiod really established the sort of architecture of a universe, a shared topography that people could think through. And I think that's what makes him so significant to later thinkers. As I mentioned here, Parmenides seems to really take a lot from Hesiod and reacts against him. So I think it's important also to keep in mind that he situates himself in the poem. And the reason I think this is important is he's trying to say something about voices in this work. He has his voice, and he will note when he is speaking for himself and when the muses are speaking through him. He has this encounter with the muses. And I'm going to go on to that. With this encounter, essentially what happens is he's out tending his sheep, and he's by Mount Helicon. As you see, there's a picture there on the right. I took that myself when I was there this summer, and it was a very interesting, eerie sight. It was covered in like dark clouds and mist, just sort of like I had imagined it would be. So the muses, they dance down from the mountain and sing as they go. They are of one mind, and we can sort of think of them as sort of interlinked entities, and at least in this portrayal. Of course, there's, with Homer, the muse is addressed in the singular, though there is a mention of 9 muses, I think, in the Iliad or the Odyssey. Nonetheless, like, this is a very distinct form for the muses to take. So the muses, what's important here, I think, is they claim we know how to tell many lies that appear like the truth, but we know how to tell the truth when we will. So they tell lies like the truth, and they tell the truth, and you never know when they're going to do it. And this kind of initiates this theme of doubling that I'm going to go to here next. So just some examples of the doubling. We've got the muses, like I said. Then there's, the muse's voice itself and Hesiod's. There's Gaia's sort of fission. She splits off from herself, parts of herself that become their own entities. We have Uranus and Kronos' mutual repression of their offspring. Kronos and Zeus as a kind of double entity, the Titans and the Olympians as double entities, the Golden Age egalitarian paradise and the post-Golden Age period, the two strifes. That's very significant at the beginning of Works and Days. Hesiod essentially says the muses were not telling the truth, and there's a second strife. And it kind of that centers his entire narrative. We have the two poems, the Theogony and the Works and Days, which I agree with a lot of scholars like Jenny Strauss-Clay, who think that these must be looked at as a singular whole. You can't really separate them from each other. We have the Kronos swallowing his offspring and Zeus's swallowing of Metis, and on and on and on. I could just keep on listening and forever. But what I think is really key about this notion of doubling for Hesiod is that anything that we encounter, there is a potential doubled version of it. And that doubled version or variant could speak to us much more than something that's really put on the surface. And here I'm meaning specifically that we are inheriting a tradition that typically reads the Theogony as a tale of Zeus the hero, who established the order of justice. And we think that because when we see the word justice translated, we think of our own notions of justice. But for Hesiod and the Greeks of this period, Dike is it's a chthonic deity. It's a deity that lives under the earth in Tartarus, and it is more associated with things like the Furies than anything else. And I think that one can read the story more as a tragedy of Kronos, and we can see Zeus as kind of a villain, and there is a element of political critique that comes with this. So, all right, then we need to get just to the story. So let's just recount what has happened for those who aren't familiar, like the basic overview. This is called the succession myth, and the succession myth appears to again be related to things like the Song of Kumarbi and the Enuma Elish, and possibly other Near Eastern lore. So the first thing that happens is that Uranos and Gaia have children, but the Uranos is driven by Eros. So the sky is driven by desire or love to cover, as it says, Gaia, the earth. And he's horrified at his offspring, both the Titans and the monsters that come to be from it. And accordingly, he forces them back down into Gaia, into her womb. The imagery here is kind of a perpetual penetration. Hesiod's a little cagey with his language here. Seems to be he's trying not to get too explicit with the sexual imagery, but it's there. And so many will call this a rape. The text suggests that it sort of begins with something consensual, but the maintaining of this penetration, which pushes down the children into the depths of Gaia, that is the part that is non-consensual, and it's spoken of as an atrocity, as a cruelty, as a great evil. And thus, Gaia wants an end to this. She needs a hero, and she asks her children who will help. And none of them are willing to step up except for the very youngest, Kronos. And she gives him a adamantine weapon, a kind of sickle. This is one of the things that we're going to see here. He's connected with the image of the sickle, a tool for harvesting. And he's sort of the Lord of the harvest in a way. And we'll get to that in a moment. But that symbol is pretty significant. And also, to know we don't really cover a whole lot of it. I'm not going to cover a lot of it here, but ultimately the way Zeus and his brothers, Hades and Poseidon, manage to defeat the Titans is they go into the earth and also receive under the earth magical weapons that allow them to fight. So with this weapon, Kronos castrates his father, Uranos, and the blood drops hit the earth, and that produces the Furies, and the actual genitalia lands in the ocean, and from that emerges Aphrodite. And there's a whole lot to that that's interesting, but we're not going to cover here. And we have, at this moment, the reign of the Titans. So The Titans, this is gonna lead to what's called the Titanomachy, the War of the Titans, and the rule of the Titans is maintained by Kronos' swallowing of his children. Crucially, I would say swallowing them whole, unlike the image we saw from Goya at the beginning. I think this is a kind of imagery that their powers are latent and undifferentiated within their father. And there's something about their release that indicates an imagery or symbol about humanity's movement from being a kind of natural being to an unnatural being, beings with language, with culture, with writing, with technology, and of course also new kinds of violence. And Kronos, he does this because he learns from Uranus and Gaia that one of his children will be his undoing. So it's one of these typical examples of in Greek myth of someone hears their fate and they want to avoid it, and in trying to avoid it, they pretty much cause it. So Rhea is grieving for her children. She seeks Gaia's help. She gives Gaia an idea of how to take care of this. So what she does is she gives Kronos an omphalos, a stone, a navel stone to swallow. It's swaddled in infant clothing. So when Zeus is born, she switches it out. She takes Zeus to Crete. He's raised there. He grows up quickly and prepares his vengeance on behalf of his mother, Rhea. He gains poison from the Titan Metis, who, for whatever reason, seems to also be unhappy with the Titan regime. And Metis, keep in mind, will be the sort of mother, not mother of Athena. Her name means like wisdom or insight, intuition. And once Kronos is tricked into swallowing this poison, he throws up his children. Then the Olympian gods emerge and they battle with the Titans. And the surface of Gaia is devastated. And Zeus consults with another Titan, Prometheus, who gives him advice on going to get those magical weapons from the Cyclops, which they use to defeat the Titans. So we're going to talk about this just, in the terms of image and motif and mythoi, that is myth. What I think we've got going on here is a kind of symbol that is etched into these tales of political critique. One that can on the surface look like a celebration of ruling powers, but is to any discerning listener in this case, or reader in our cases, you can see that there's more going on. And the more that's going on can really be explained. I'm going to go ahead and skip a few here, just to go on to this one. It can be explained by the practice of the Chronia. The Chronia was a festival, and it was held at a certain time in Attica and a certain time in Ionia. But what's important for us, we can connect it to Saturnalia and medieval festivals. It's a kind of festival in which the enslaved people of the area got to party. And often their masters would wear the clothing of servants and slaves, and the enslaved people would wear clothing of royalty and present themselves as sort of kings and aristocrats and rulers. There's a whole lot of imagery here of uncrowning and travesty and thrashing. And how is this all connected to Kronos? Well, Kronos was thought to be the ruler, the god who ruled the golden age. That was a time of paradise. And this is an image that seems to come from Near Eastern notions of paradise. It's completely egalitarian. There's a kind of immediacy in which nature just produces what people need spontaneously without any need for technology or knowledge. And this is disrupted and overcome. First, with the Titanomachy, it causes so much destruction, wiping out this first generation of humans. But also what comes after, as detailed in the works and days, is a new regime in which Zeus is not the best or kindliest ruler. Prometheus makes an effort to work around this, and he's punished in perpetuity for it. Um, and basically, Zeus, he takes this second strife that I mentioned earlier, and it says he sets it into the roots of the earth so that humans must struggle to live. And the whole imagery here is that after this initial period, there now must be struggle to live. Life is now hellish and difficult. And there's a yearning for that pre-class, pre-Zeus reign, pre-Olympian period that's expressed through the Chronia. And I think we got to ask ourselves, what does it mean to institute collective rituals that symbolize a kind of social revolution? We know from various sources that the celebrations of the Chronia were often a problem for city leaders. There was a lot of repression of it over time. For instance, the whole month was called the Chronion, I think, and then it was changed in Attica. So there's a lot of research to be done here that I am very interested in. There's a lot of things to be connected to Saturnalia, to medieval expressions of this. I haven't even mentioned Mikhail Bakhtin's Rabelais in His World, which really details this as a kind of medieval thing. These festivals, these rituals are about equality and about the protest of people against the conditions of their lives. They want to enjoy themselves. They want to enjoy one another. They want equality. They want rulers to be laid low. And I think in the image of Kronos as this hero who saved his mother, and then ruler of this happy egalitarian age who's then overthrown, and then what comes after is this startling inequality and suffering. I think that this shows us that there's a kind of cultural resonance that we see in possibly with other Near Eastern peoples who had similar succession myth tales, with a notion of our conditions are not natural or fair, and that they will one day change, and we yearn for them to change. That sounds very simple, but I think there's a lot to be unpacked there. I'm going to leave it at that so we have some time for questions. And I guess I need to end this screen sharing. Let's see here. Stop share.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, got it. Okay.
Thank you very much, Jase. That was really interesting. We don't have a lot of audience questions, but we do have one that they say is possibly off topic, so do your best. We see in the Greco-Roman novels many instances of the upper social strata being brought into slavery and serfdom via capture by pirates and human trafficking. Asking you, they say, to irresponsibly speculate, do you think there's a similar cultural resonance with the audiences of these novels, many of whom would be freed slaves, but also upper status people?
Yeah, I do. I think that there's a lot of people who go through life in the ancient world who maybe at some point in their life were enslaved, and then they're not. And they carry with them, a strong sense of like, I don't want to be a part of that anymore. And it's a travesty. Better someone else than me. But it's tales like that resonate. They make sense. These things, the things that survive from antiquity are things that echoed off of people. And once they felt that there was something significant, more people wanted to produce it, more people wanted to hear it. So yeah, I mean, speculation, I don't have a concrete connection here to that, but that's interesting. And I'd like to look into it myself. Oh, lost you.
Sorry, I mute myself to minimize child noise, and then I forget to unmute.
I got you. I've got one too.
Would you say that the last summary is largely Hesiod's take, or more common across the Greek world?
Right. So this characterization of Kronos and this version of the tale becomes the dominant one. And it seems that by the classical period, this is the one that is kind of the standard for most Greek peoples, but that was not the case when he composed it, obviously. And there are other theogonies. We have fragments of, reconstructions of, some that even mention an entity like Kronos. But I would say that this is very much Hesiod's invention, his characterization, and that characterization became the dominant one. And the connection to the festival itself, we don't really know. We don't have as much evidence for that festival as we'd like. We have bits and pieces, but we know way more about the Saturnalia, which we also don't know a whole lot about, than we know about the Chronia. But I think that Hesiod is reacting to a general culture in which there's a lot of these tales, these theogonies going around, these stories of how the gods came to be and which ones are the superior ones, who was first, and who was first means a lot. And then for whatever reason, his was the most resonant. And in the minds, at least, of the people who are engaging with the Chronia and the classical period, that's the Chronos I would say they probably have in mind, unless they have some local cult that's connected. And
Thank you. Does the image of a relief valve actually suggest that festivals functioned not to promote the change, but instead sustain the status quo?
you know, I'm wondering about that language that I've used too, because I mean, I realize I sort of put it without reflection, and now I've been reflecting on it and wanting to think about festivals in general. I think I think festivals, like anything that's a socially produced thing, they're contested. And I think that the meaning of festivals and rituals is always contested. And I would say it would seem that there was a point from the evidence we got where it wasn't tampering down the energies, it was building them up, the sense of social protest of the very weakest, the most indebted. A lot of people, I'm sure, aware of the fact that there was a huge debt crisis that led to massive class struggle, which then led to Solon's reforms and essentially what we think of as Athenian democracy. And Athenian democracy was sort of we're going to do this instead of just completely destroying the place, completely wiping out the aristocracy or something. So I think that these festivals and rituals likely, the intention is not to promote, it is to release. I think it is to find ways to salve the wounds of the everyday life, to find a way to break up that everyday routine and make it acceptable. Oh, muted again.
It's been a long day.
Yeah, sure.
We have one final question, and then I have a couple of announcements to make before we wrap up. Someone is asking or stating more that ancient Greece was splintered, not like a unified country that we see today, but more of a collection of cities. Is that correct?
That is absolutely correct. And that's why I tried to say Greek speakers, because also we import notions of ethnicity and race from the 20th or 19th and 20th century into the ancient world, and it's totally illegitimate. So if a Greek is someone who speaks Greek in the ancient world, and if you don't speak Greek, you speak bar, hence barbarian. That was their idea. And so the Archaic period, this is when we're seeing the beginning of the city-state formation. Previously, there was the Mycenaean civilization, which was more stratified, warrior class, and then it collapsed. And the Archaic period is the one in which we're starting to see the buildup of what will become the city-state system. And one of the most important things for city-states is festivals. And at festivals, people recite poems and perform poems and plays and athletic events and all that. That's the context of the performance of the Theogony or the Iliad or the Odyssey. Especially like the Odyssey, for instance, there would be kind of a relay race of poem of the poetry. So someone would go up to a certain bit of it, and then they would stop, and then someone else would pick it up from there. And you can see how this results in a lot of variability, a lot of diversification. So there are, with Hesiod's account, which is written, we think, pretty early, there's an attempt to cohere a lot of that. And it kind of forms a basis of, no one really takes it as like the gospel truth or something, as in later Orthodox religions will take it. But it is sort of like, okay, we're going to use this as the baseline story. Everything else is kind of a variation on that.
Thank you. That's really, really helpful and interesting. We are going to let you go because it's about 5:15 and there is one more event. But thank you again, Jase, for a fascinating presentation. Appreciate
it. Thanks so much.
Okay, everybody, that is actually it for our academic presentations for the weekend. It's been a fantastic conference. As always, the level of preparation and skill and just sheer research that goes into these is really quite breathtaking, especially when you consider that a lot of these people are doing it as a passion, because getting a job in academia is virtually impossible. So thank you to all of our presenters, to all of our keynote speakers, to everyone who ran or participated in a workshop. I know I'm going to be going back and looking at those again myself, make sure I catch all of the interesting and useful things that were said. We have one more event for the day and for the conference. That is a social hour. It starts at 5:15 and ends at 6:15. That's Eastern Daylight Time. And you can RSVP on the virtual conference website. I put a link to it in all of the chats that you should all be watching. You can just click on the link, fill out the form, and you'll be sent the relevant Zoom link almost immediately. So if you're interested in chatting with the presenters for today and other audience members, go and enjoy yourselves. And thank you again for your time and your interest.